to those who just joined in the short Q&A, which was really good, and look forward to Dean coming back on later, and Andrew also. So I'm really delighted to introduce David Gray-Hammond here to the conference today. David is an autistic mental health, wellbeing and addiction advocate and consultant. David has a degree in forensic archaeology. He is also a writer. He began by writing a blog called emergentdivergence.com and published his first book in November 2022. David's journey has been full of turmoil and he has overcome addiction and psychosis. David was diagnosed with autism when he was 26 years, which is 7 years ago. So sorry, David, I have just given your age away. David was also diagnosed with schizophrenia last year, and he's awaiting assessment for a diagnosis of ADHD. David and I had a discussion yesterday about this session. Some of it might be quite hard to hear about, and I'm going to stay on and ask David some questions about his lived experiences. There will be some time at the end of the session for questions from the audience, so please put your questions in the question section and I will ask some of these at the end. Okay, you all right, David? Great. Okay, so are you able to talk a little bit about your journey in growing up into adulthood?
Yeah, so my mother, she's always known I was autistic. She tried to get me diagnosed when I was, I think, about 4 years old. And ongoing throughout my life, she tried to get me diagnosed. She worked in inclusion. She was, involved in special educational needs coordinating. And she was told she was an over-anxious mother with too much knowledge of the subject. And, I struggled through school horrendously with bullying, and even the teachers bullied me, to be honest. And on top of that, I'd experienced some very unlucky things throughout my life, which I won't detail here because it's 11:40 in the morning and I don't want to ruin everyone's day. But I'd experienced a lot of trauma growing up. And it really came to a head when I was in my final year of my A-levels. I was 18 years old and started hearing voices. I didn't know what was happening. So I was really, really, really scared. And I turned to drugs and alcohol because that's what my friends were doing. And I very quickly learned that, if I smoked a joint or drank some vodka, I felt better. I went off to university, okay, and at university, I understandably fell in with more friends who use drugs. At university, there is, more people who use drugs around. It just seems to be part of the culture. And because I was already a drug user, I found them quite easily. They gave me a community that I had never had. I felt like people accepted David, the drug user, more than they accepted David, the autistic person. Although at the time, obviously, I hadn't been diagnosed. And whilst I knew everyone thought I was autistic, I hadn't really come to terms with it myself. So all I knew was these drug users made me feel like I belonged somewhere. And it gave me an opportunity to fundamentally change my identity into something that I felt was better accepted. I would like to note here that I think it says something when you feel that a drug addict identity is better accepted than an autistic identity. That really says something, I think, about the attitudes towards autistic people. So I was entering early adulthood. I think it's important to note here, I never had any HCP. I never had any kind of special educational needs support because no one would listen to my mother with how much I was struggling. I had to take 3 months off school during my GCSEs because I was just so burnt out. We used to say I'd had a nervous breakdown, but looking back, I know now it was autistic shutdown.
Yeah.
And I don't really remember those 3 months because I was just so dissociated from the real world. So I lost 3 months of my GCSEs in secondary school, still no educational support. They did a lot to threaten my mum with court action if I didn't come back to school, but they didn't do anything to actually help me. And yeah, it was really difficult because, you know, as an advocate, I'm aware that that period from 14 plus, if I'd have been under an EHCP, I would have been on the sort of transition to adulthood pathway. We would have been looking at things like positive risk taking. We would have been looking at developing my skills for independence, you know, keeping myself safe in the community, keeping myself safe in the home, you know, some basic skills around daily living. I had very few of these skills when I was an adult because it was like people had just expected me to intrinsically know them.
Yeah.
I didn't. So, you know, my whole world became about drugs and alcohol. Everything else went to the sidelines. The fact that I achieved my degree, I don't know how I managed to get a second-class honours whilst using drugs and alcohol and really doing very little else.
That's about your resilience of who you are.
Yeah,
as well.
yeah. You know,
and what do you think the impact of a late diagnosis then, as it, you know, has had on you as a neurodivergent adult?
So there's a couple of flip sides to this, really. First of all, being a late diagnosed neurodivergent adult meant that my childhood was incredibly difficult. I had no support outside of my family. I had no support from authorities. I had no support from schools. People treated me terribly outside of the family unit. But getting that diagnosis as an adult, it was like a light bulb moment. You know, it was like suddenly everything made sense. But I have to say, when you're diagnosed as an adult, you go through a lot of emotions because you have to go through your entire life of memories, you know, and think about how many memories you have by the time you're 26 years old. I had to go through every memory I had and reframe it under the new knowledge that, yes, I'm definitely autistic.
Yes.
And whilst it made everything made sense, the amount of, how do I put this? The amount of, it took a lot of brain power to reframe my life, you know, and that's for me at 26. So who knows how difficult it could be for someone who's in their 30s, 40s, 50s. You know, we're asking them to not just, you know, take on this knowledge that they are autistic. We're asking them to consider that the entire way they have understood their life might need to be understood another way.
Yes, yeah. And I know that you spent some time in a psychiatric inpatient unit. Are you able to talk a little bit about your experience with this as an autistic adult, and what improvements do you think would be helpful?
Yeah, so I've done 2 stays in a psychiatric inpatient unit. Again, I won't go into too much detail because a lot of what I experienced as an autistic adult in an inpatient unit was not okay. I was in there because of psychosis the second time, and the first time I was in there to detox off of very, very addictive drugs. And both occasions, psychosis became the main issue. And the first time wasn't too bad because I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe it was just a different culture because it was a different hospital. The second time, though, within 24 hours of arriving, they took one look at me, and you've got to understand, I am 6.5 foot tall and weigh 150 kilos. They took one look at me and went, well, you're a big guy, so we're going to keep you sedated. Well, I haven't done anything, but they just kept me sedated. There were times when I was so heavily sedated that I couldn't string a sentence together. I witnessed restraint being used as a punishment. It felt like I was a nuisance living in their workplace rather than them recognizing that that was my home for the time being, and they were coming into it. And I know that one of the big issues here is starters, they have no knowledge around autistic experience. As far as they were concerned, my autistic behaviors were nuisance. They were an aberration. They were something to be dealt with, not something that I needed support with. There wasn't enough staff. We need a lot more staff in inpatient units. And those staff all need to be trained in autistic experience by autistic people. And for that matter, neurodivergent experience. You know, I'm a big believer in the neurodiversity movement as a whole. So I think it would probably serve them better to move away from the pathologization of mental health altogether and consider things through the lens of neurodiversity, because there is an awful lot of stigma around inpatient units and mental health. They feel a lot like prisons at the moment. You don't feel like you're there to get better. You feel like you're being punished. Even the way they're laid out, the systems they have in place for your safety, the use of restraint and seclusion, it does not feel like a place that you have gone to get better. And I think they really need to have better model of service user involvement. And they need to seriously listen to what those service users have to say, not just pay it lip service.
Yes, really, really true to hear what people are saying and the experiences that, you know, like yourself, it must have been a really terrible time for you. And I can see that there are a lot of love hearts coming out to you, and there's some agreement and claps also by, you know, what you're saying and what you're talking about. Priscilla, in the session before, she talked a bit about what she'd learnt about that she wished she'd learnt in education, and you mentioned a bit before about, you know, when we talk about the impact of a late diagnosis and your experience about not being education when you were doing your GCSEs due to burnout. In your experience, what do you think neurodivergent people need to be taught in school to prepare for adulthood?
So, first of all, I think we really need to consider the double empathy problem. So the idea that, you know, autistic people don't have a deficit in their communication. It's a cultural difference between autistic and non-autistic people. And we need to use that to inform education around things like social dynamics and, you know, interpersonal interactions and relationships. Because so often autistic people are in a vulnerable position and people try to manipulate that vulnerability. This means that, you know, when we consider that transition to adulthood phase, we already have a significant area of need in accessing the community, because no one really teaches us how to do it safely, because non-autistic people seem to learn a lot of this by osmosis. I found as an autistic person, it wasn't that I was incapable, but I need to be explicitly instructed on, you know, how something works before I feel confident to do it. So I do believe, you know, education around sort of interpersonal dynamics, power relationships between people, communicating with family units, things like that. It needs to be done, but it needs to be done in such a way that it does not frame the autistic person as being less than or having a communication deficit. We also need help with practical things. I went into adulthood unsure how to use a washing machine because it was overwhelming. It's full of buttons and flashing lights and knobs and drawers that you pour liquid into. You know, don't get me wrong, I was at university, I was using scanning electron microscopes and laser ablation mass spectrometers were no problem. You put me in front of a washing machine. Apparently I was wrong to put DAS in it, because apparently that's not, stain remover is not the main thing you put in them. So, you know, I need explicit instruction around things like how to support a home, how to be part of a home. What do I do when something goes wrong? Who do I call if the plumbing's not working or the electricals are failing? You know, what do I do? You know, someone should probably make sure, and this goes for all kids, that they know what to do sensibly if something catches fire in the kitchen. You know, and another big one, managing money. No one teaches you this. I still, to this day, I'm self-employed. I have to pay an accountant to do my taxes because I have no idea how any of it works. You know, these are all things that should have been done to prepare me for adulthood.
And I think it's also more difficult these days because nobody sees money either, really, as well. So
no, you don't see the money anymore. It's all electronic.
Yeah.
So it's an abstract concept.
Yes, that's right. And what about things that people might need to be taught in relation to about keeping yourself safe and accessing the community?
So I think this is important here. So often you can have an issue with crossing context. So autistic people can learn something logically, but then it might take some time to apply, to process that information and apply it across a new context. So one example I can think of is I've worked with autistic people who have been exploited through county lines. And what we find is that, you know, they'll have their group of friends and they won't recognize that they're being exploited, because they can be taught logically, this is what exploitation looks like, but they have a idea of what this group of friends are, and they are not able to process the new information and apply it to this new group of friends. It's like a form of cognitive dissonance. You know, you need to provide time and space and support for autistic people, especially if you're teaching them about things like exploitation. It's going to be a very slow process of helping them apply that to their life, because these concepts for keeping yourself safe in the community, they're really heavy going. We need to know about them at a fairly young age, because the exploitation of autistic people, especially, the age is getting younger and younger.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So even when we talk about preparation for adulthood at 14, actually, you know, perhaps it needs to start younger.
I would argue start looking into it, you know, round about the transition to secondary school.
Yeah. Okay. And you've got a new book called The New Normal: Autistic Musings on the Threat of a Broken Society.
Yes.
I've read it. It's very good. Amazon Kindle is very easy to download. It's brilliant. It's a collection of pieces of your writing from your blog, isn't it? And more. Do you want to just give an overview about it, if you can?
Yeah. So you're right. It is a collection of essays from my blog, but they're not the same as the essays anymore, because what I did was, a lot of the essays I wrote years ago, so I took them and updated them with new knowledge I've acquired through, you know, the academic circles I run in and the professional circles that I run in, and sort of updated these essays. And the whole aim of the essay anthology, the book, The New Normal, is to look at the ways that essentially society is broken by design when you're autistic. You know, the ways that society is harming autistic people, the ways it frames autistic people as less than. I look at barriers to what we at Academy term autopia, which is it's our imaginary autistic homeland where everyone fits in and is accommodated. So I consider some of the barriers to accommodating autistic people. I also get into things like neuroqueer theory and the idea of normativity and, you know, liberating oneself from pathology paradigms and the idea that there is such a thing as a normal way of being, thinking, and behaving. So it was a love letter to the autistic community, really, and in fact the prologue is titled that. You know, it was something I'd wanted to do for a long time, and I wanted to make sure the autistic community felt heard.
Yes. I think they do. I can see that some people have read it, and also plugging the book for you as well, David. And I enjoyed the part around you feeling that you became part of that community once you had your diagnosis as well, and you were warmly welcomed by the autistic community, and that really, was really something impactful for you. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing: is the autistic community fundamentally saved my life. It wouldn't be, next week, I think 7th of April, I'm going to be 7 years sober from addiction. It wouldn't have happened without the autistic community. It wouldn't have survived psychosis without the autistic community. It just wouldn't be here if the autistic community had not opened its arms to me and said, "Come on in, you're one of us."
Yeah, that's really amazing. Okay, David, what would you say your proudest moment?
Obviously publishing a book was one of my proudest moments. I think the proudest moment I've ever had was last October, the birth of my son, because that was something I never thought I would have. I never thought I would be a dad, but here I am. I have a beautiful baby boy, and getting to watch him grow is astounding.
It's amazing.
It is. And certainly, if I could go back and talk to my younger self, if I was speaking to my younger self before the drug use, I would tell myself that, the traumas I had experienced were not my fault, that there was nothing I could have done to stop them, and that it's okay to tell people that I'm struggling. If I could talk to my younger self who was using drugs and alcohol, I would certainly tell him, it's not your fault that you are using drugs and alcohol. This is what happens when we don't support autistic people appropriately. And I would also tell that person, all the things you think you will never achieve because of drugs and alcohol, they're coming, and you will get to them in your own space and time.
Well, David, there's a comment at the end which says, "You're an inspiration. Thanks for giving us some insight into your world. I've learned so many things I think about in terms of helping my teenager." So it's really been, absolutely a pleasure, and I'm humbled to be able to talk with you today. I'm just going to quickly look onto the chat because I think there's some questions here, if that's okay, David. Here we go. So there's a question from Bobby. How do you see society viewing autistic people in the future?
So I talk about this a lot on my blog. I'm very much a neurofuturist. I would like to move into a world where being autistic, rather, because autism doesn't necessarily exist. It's an abstract concept. What does exist is autistic people. And I would like autistic people to be seen as a cultural group, an identity group. I think there needs to be a move away from the medicalization of autism. Now, I recognize that being autistic can come with intellectual disability and, greater increase in things like mental health concerns and physical health concerns. But fundamentally, the autistic part of us, there's not saying the autistic part of us, there isn't an autistic part of us. Our whole self is autistic. And I think medicalizing it implies there is a way of removing that and finding a neurotypical person underneath. I would like to move into a world where people stop trying to remove the autisticness from the autistic person and just accept us as we are and allow us to identify in the way that feels most comfortable to us.
Okay. And what helped you to break the addiction, David? It's a question here also.
So I had support from substance misuse services in my city. I was lucky that the key worker I was assigned was very good, although really didn't know much about autism, but they were very supportive. I had a mental health care coordinator. This is a very rare occurrence because usually mental health services won't treat you until the addiction is sorted, and substance misuse services won't treat you until the mental health is sorted. Luckily, my two key workers, when this system is ridiculous, let's talk to each other. So many, I mean, it took months for them to do that, but they did do that. So many, especially autistic people, who are more likely to have a mental health condition, who are more likely to self-medicate. You know, so many people fall through the gaps because services go, well, we can't do this until that service has dealt with you. And then that service goes, well, we can't do this until the other service has dealt with you. We need joined up, communication and work. But what helped me was having a supportive group of professionals, supportive family, supportive friends. And ultimately, the moment that turned my life around started turning my life around was when I woke up in hospital having had a very life-threatening event. I realized if I didn't stop, I was going to die, and I wasn't ready to die. It was after that I went into detox. I got sober, got diagnosed autistic, found the autistic community, and the rest, as we say, is history.
So a very large turning point for you. I can see that. Also, as somebody else has asked, what has helped you with the voices?
So medication has been very helpful. Now, I think it's important to note here that as a schizophrenic person, I don't view myself as mentally ill. I see schizophrenia as another form of neurodivergence. My brain works differently. Yes, it can be distressing, but, autistic burnout can be distressing. Doesn't mean that we don't see being autistic as part of neurodivergence. I take medication as a tool to help me function, let's say. I don't like the word function, but medication is a tool to help me function in a world that is not well suited to the needs of the way my brain works. So medication has been very helpful. I've had trauma therapy. I have to say I've had quite a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy. At best, it was moderately helpful. A lot of the time, they just did not understand how my autistic brain worked. But I've had a lot of therapy. I take medication, and I have spent a lot of time with myself, being quite introspective, thinking about delusions I've experienced, the things I've heard voices say, and trying to link together, why did I have those experiences? How do they link back to experiences I've had in my past?
Wow. David, it really is, humbling to hear, and thank you so much for being so honest. It's quite courageous to come on and talk about your experience. There's just one question here, which is from somebody who's just talking about their son, and sort of similar story to yourself, drug addiction, section many times with very unsympathetic psychiatrist, not diagnosed till 28, still an addict, and lives in an isolated existence. And this person's at a loss about how to help him. They say he's lovely, intelligent, and a wonderful artist. I feel society has discarded him, and it's so hard to know where to turn. I'd love him to join the autistic community, but he resists. How to empower him? What do you think?
So I think you have to find ways of scaffolding in knowledge around autistic experience. And so when I mentor people, I work with them to help them understand things like monotropism, double empathy, burnout, energy accounting, so spoon theory, you know, the basics of autistic experience are really, really important. You need that foundation, that bedrock. From there, we can work to identify where there are areas of need. Within those areas of need, we can work out, are they areas of need because there needs to be a boundary in place? Are they areas of need because there is professional support that needs to be in place? So if it's because boundary needs to be in place, mentors, for example, could work with the person to empower them to set healthy boundaries and maintain them, that will do things like protect their cognitive resources from being oversubscribed. If it's because of a lack of professional support, it's a bit more complicated. You really need independent advocacy in this situation. There are a number of us out here in the autistic community who do advocacy. And, it's important to note that in the autistic community, advocate's a bit of a catch-all term, because anyone who speaks out on behalf of autistic people is sort of seen as an advocate. But what I'm talking about here is more the statutory definition of an advocate, someone who understands mental health law, for example, can, go to tribunals and things like that. So
individuals' rights, etc.
Yeah, they know the rights that a person has. So really, if it's about needing professional support that's not being given, you really want to look for independent advocacy services that can support that person into getting the support they need.
Okay. And there's one that asks, did you feel it was important for your substance misuse key worker and mental health key worker to have knowledge and understanding of neurodivergence when working with adults with neurodivergence?
I feel like the process of me achieving sobriety would have been a lot quicker if they'd have understood anything about being autistic. The main thing that they kept talking about was the lack of eye contact. And I was like, I don't even have too much of a problem with eye contact, so I don't know why we keep coming back to this. Because they were aware I was autistic, even though I didn't get my diagnosis till 6 months after getting sober. They worked with me under the pretense that I was autistic, because it was obvious to the professionals as soon as I started trying to get sober. But I think if they'd have had real training around the nature of being autistic, if they had really engaged with the autistic community, it would have made a world of difference, not just for me, but for the people they work with. And trust me when I say, if you are working in mental health, if you are working in substance misuse, the vast majority of the people you are working with are neurodivergent in some way.
Okay, David, there are so many comments here about your book being brilliant, and thanking you for talking about your experience today. I think it's really touched really a lot of people here, and the information that you've given has been supportive, particularly to those that have been asking questions about their own family as well. So we really do appreciate the time that you've taken today to come and talk to us. Really very much appreciated. So we're going to take a break now, and then we will return at 12:30 again. So thank you very much again, David, and we'll see everybody else in 15 minutes. Thank you.